I am very pleased tonight to introduce Hala Jaber, who was born in West Africa, grew up in Lebanon, apart from a spell at a British boarding school, poor thing. She began her career in journalism at the Associated Press news agency in Beirut in the mid-1980s. She was actually hired for that job by Terry Anderson, who was shortly afterwards kidnapped. You get any bit of feedback there? I do have a loud voice, so it might be repeating. No, keep going? Okay. For the past few years, Hala has been a correspondent with the Sunday Times. She covered the invasion of Iraq. She was, I think, one of the only journalists in Fallujah at the time of the siege, when it was occupied by Sunni militants and sympathizers of al-Qaeda and surrounded by the Americans. She twice won Foreign Correspondent of the Year, and in 2007 she won the Martha Gellhorn Prize for journalism. Hala lives in London and has lived here for some time. Her book, The Flying Carpet to Baghdad, which I just read this weekend and is a real page-turner, so I thoroughly recommend that, is the story of how she tried to save two small Iraqi girls whose family had been killed during the invasion by an American missile strike. And it's also, I think, the story of what it means to be a female journalist in a war zone. It's a story of what it means to be a foreign correspondent and the difficulties that all foreign correspondents have with, you know, keeping their emotions in check in very difficult circumstances. And it's also the story of what it means to be a Muslim from an Arab culture covering the Western invasion of Iraq, which put Hala in a very unique position. I'm going to ask her to do a short reading from the book before we start. And if you'd like to read from where I've marked to the stars, that'd be great. Thank you. Age. Oh, and I should probably just give a little bit of an introduction to this reading. The book starts with how persuading the Sunday Times to launch an appeal to help children in Iraq during the war. And in order to launch the appeal, she needs to find a child to be the figure of the poster campaign. I mean, perhaps you should, you're looking, before you read, maybe you should just describe a little bit of the sort of child that you're looking for.
Hi, thank you for coming. It was something along those lines. We need a child, not any child. A girl, better than a boy, not less than 1 year, because that won't be expressive enough. Between 1 and 3. That would be better. Someone who's lost a lot, a huge family, who's injured, seriously injured, yet not injured enough that she would look ugly in pictures. So it was like a shopping list, basically, to go around hospital and find this particular child to launch the appeal for the children.
So this is a passage about Hala looking for the child and finding the one.
I saw her immediately, a tiny figure in that huge room, swathed in bandages like a miniature mummy, and sleeping on her side beneath a blanket that was draped over a tunnel-shaped lattice to keep it from touching her skin. She was oblivious to the pain of the burnt woman in the bed beyond her, but something was disturbing the child. As she slept, her pale eyelids twitched as toddlers do when they are having a nightmare. She moaned softly, as if too exhausted by her suffering to cry out. By her bed stood her grandmother, who was fanning her with a piece of cardboard. Tears were running down the old woman's face. She looked as if she had been weeping round the clock for days. I hardly dared breathe as I approached, for fear of exhaling microbes that might harm so delicate a child. When I reached the bedside, I saw that her arms were shaking uncontrollably, and although she appeared to be unconscious, I could make out some words. Cold, cold, she whimpered. I glanced at the doctor, thinking he might move forward to make her warm somehow, but he stared impassively. I presumed it was normal for someone who has been burned to feel cold. "Cover me up, Mama," the little girl said. "Baba, Daddy, where are you? I'm cold." The same words were repeated over and over again. Whether she was conscious or not, she had never needed her mother more desperately, and yet she was an orphan. The doctor was clinical. The 3-year-old patient had sustained deep second and third degree burns to her face, back, arms, and legs, he said, and contusions to the right arm and both legs. There were already signs of septicemia, he added coolly. If she could not be transferred from his non-sterile ward into a more appropriate environment within a few days, she would die. It was as simple as that, the doctor said. He did not have the facilities she needed, and he could not provide the care that was required for her condition. His words were devoid of emotion, but by the time he had finished speaking, I was in tears. Steve placed a hand on my shoulder, and I met his eyes. Only he really understood why I was making such an exhibition of myself. He knew that I was prone to extreme emotions when I was run down, and that, like a lot of foreign correspondents, I always struggled to cope with the side of a child hurt by war. He also realized instinctively that this encounter was especially poignant for me. The little girl was calling for a mother who would never come, and I had longed for a daughter like her who would never appear either. I had been unprepared for how strongly I would respond as a childless woman to this motherless child. The ferocity of my reaction made me shudder. It would have been selfish to pity myself at such a moment, and I did not do so. But I had no defenses left against all these feelings that assailed me. I was overwhelmed. Something about my reaction stirred the girl's grandmother, however. She motioned me into the corridor outside, and there she recounted the family tragedy. The child's name was Zahra. It means flower in Arabic, and she was 3.5. She did not yet know the terrible truth that her mother, father, 4 brothers, and a sister she adored had all been killed by a missile from an American warplane which had hit their car on the morning of 4th April. Only Zahra and her 3-month-old baby sister Hawra had survived. Zahra's too young to understand what it must have been like for her mother in that blazing car with her children dying around her, the grandmother said. But perhaps one day, when she has children of her own, she'll know how difficult it must have been for her mother to choose which of them to save. She had hurled Hawra through a broken window of the vehicle, and the baby had survived virtually uninjured. But by the time she threw Zahra out a few seconds later, the flames had taken hold. That was why Zahra had been so badly burned. One of the boys had got out after that, but his clothes had been on fire, and nobody had thought he would last more than a few days. Their father Ali, their mother Rasmiya, and the other children had perished in seconds, where they sat or soon afterwards in hospital. I could not speak. "Please help my little girl Zahra," the grandmother said, clutching my hand. She had watched me crying on the ward, had seen my concern for the child, and imagined I could make everything all right. "Please don't let her die. Please take her away. Please make her better for me," she begged. "You mustn't let her die. She's lost everyone. You owe it to her to help her live. I'm appealing to you to help her." With that, my tears flowed again. I hate big promises, yet I could not deny this old woman. I wanted to help, so I looked her straight in the eye and gave her my word. "Your granddaughter will live," I told her solemnly. "I'll make sure she receives the treatment she needs, whatever the cost." The old woman wept once more, drained by the effort of pleading with me, and buoyed by relief at my response. She squeezed my hand more tightly than before, and brought her face up close to mine. "Zahra is yours now," she said sweetly. It was a figure of speech, or so I assumed. What she meant, surely, was that it was my job to make Zahra get the care that would save her. In that sense, Zahra had become my responsibility. She would have life, I vowed. She would have hope. She would have a future. No one could be more determined than me to see to that.
Just to put this search for Zahra into context, I was very struck by the conditions that you describe in Baghdad at that point. You're driving round with Steve, your husband, who's a photographer, in very dangerous conditions, going round the hospitals where even the doctors are carrying AK-47s.
Yes, it was just immediately after the fall of Baghdad and the ousting of Saddam. I mean, the city seemed to have gone on a rampage, basically, of looting everything, down to the most, you know, to the simplest thing, to the nail and the doorknob and the window. So and nothing was immune, not even hospitals. So they were even going into hospitals and looting hospitals. So very few hospitals were left, if you want, with their facilities. And those that were, the doctors took it upon themselves to have guards outside and for them to be carrying Kalashnikovs inside because they were worried about the looters coming in and they still had patients to deal with. So in a crazy way, the city, if you want, was like on some big feast vacation, you know, because they were happy. Everybody was on the street looting, you know, ministries, offices, government institutions, shops, you name it, they were taking. And hospitals were taking guards. And yet, in the middle of all this, we're trying to find a particular child. And in between visiting all these various hospitals from different areas and also looking at other kids and deciding yes, no, no, yes.
And you mentioned that you all were already observing certain militias taking up positions on street corners, and it said, and you said it reminded me of Beirut just before the civil war broke out, which was clearly very prescient.
It was bizarre because there were tiny signs. You know, suddenly all these groups of people came back to Iraq from exile and from within, and you found, you know, a little house here, and there's a sign up saying, you know, I don't know, the party of this, that, or the other. All these names were popping up, you know, or political parties, democratic parties, I don't know what parties. And it very much looked like Lebanon before, because suddenly, you know, everybody was popping up, and you could see, like, well, I was in my mind flashing back and thinking, okay, this is the beginning. Then they form into militias, and then militias get armed, and then militias are fighting each other for territory or power or influence. And you're in a civil war. So we're driving, looking at all this, and in the middle of all this, there was looting. In the middle of all this, there's chaos. There's arms on the street. You don't know anymore who's who. And driving along, you don't even know whether this neighborhood is now under this control or that control. So all of these were like flashbacks for me from Beirut times. And I looked at Steve and I said, my God, this is like Beirut. We're going to have civil war here very soon.
So you find your poster girl, and which is a horrible way of putting it, but for Zahra becomes the face of the Sunday Times campaign appeal. But she's very, very ill, and she has to be got out of the hospital and into a facility where they can deal with burns. So, I mean, tell us how you then go about that, because I mean, you've got your job as a journalist. You've got to write your story about Zahra. The photograph is taken. The campaign is launched. But in the meantime, you have to deal with the organisation of getting this very sick little girl into a better hospital. It
wasn't easy because I mean, when I looked at Zahra, something in me, I think, snapped as well. It was an accumulation of a lot of things. Obviously, also having spent 3 months there throughout the war and seeing lots of other children being hurt, damaged, killed, injured, crying, and all of these had, you know, aside from the journalist side of things, they also had a personal effect on me. So Zahra was, if you want, the last straw for me. And I felt, and throughout the war, I kept on thinking I wanted to help these kids. If only I could, if only I could get them out, if only I could save them, if only I could protect them, you know, crazy thoughts in your mind. So when it came to finally Zahra, I felt like, okay, if only I could help this one child. So I went back to the hotel and I called my boss, and he knows me now by now, because sometimes when I start talking in my ranting, crazy, passionate, crying, I don't know what manner. I don't think he understands a single word. It's like I'm a total foreigner, alien for something. And he was like, what? And I was like, no, 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 Zahra. No. And he was like, what is going on? And I was like, we have to help this child. And so he listened, and I said, we really must help this child, just this one child. She needs to get out, and we have 72 hours, otherwise she dies. That much we knew. And there was an organization coming that we had become partners with as an NGO. They were coming to help Iraq, you know. And if we were to launch an appeal and collect money, that money would go to them, and they would be able to help medically in other shapes or forms. So Merlin would be there tomorrow, and you can show them Zahra, and sure they will help. So we thought, great, you know. So Merlin came and we took them, and they saw Zahra, and he said Zahra really needs to be evacuated. Like,
and it's a French doctor who turns up, isn't it?
He's a French doctor, and a very cool doctor, and you know, he's talking about everything they want to do in the country. But at that point in time, I didn't want to know about everything they want to do in the country. I want to know that I have 72 hours. How do we get this girl out of this country? That's all that matters now. Later is another story. So I pleaded with him to go with me now to the hospital and see her. And when he did, he came back and said, yes, she doesn't have, if she stays, she's definitely dead by Monday, because there was no facilities. And in the particular hospital she was, it was stripped to the bare minimum. The bed she was on was filthy anyway.
She had septicemia by this point.
And she had septicemia, and they didn't even have proper, you know, the oxygen tanks that you put something like this. And you know, you have flies running around or flying about, and her grandmother is fanning her with a cardboard. And you know, they give us a gown and something to put on the head, but it's not sufficient even for us to go in with all the, you know, all the dust from outside. So she was in a really bad state, and he said, yes, if she stays till Monday, we're looking at Friday now, Thursday, Friday, if she's here by Monday, she will be dead. So Merlin he was very cool, and he called their offices in Amman, and Amman said, absolutely, we'll bring her to Amman, and we'll give her the best treatment. So I felt great, but then Amman called and said, but you need to arrange for evacuation from Iraq, an ambulance to drive her all the way to the border. So we're talking in those days 10 to 12 hours minimum. No adults with her, so no family members to go with her either. So we're looking at a 3.5-year-old child in an ambulance in the midst of looting and craziness in Iraq, driving all the way to the border, and she doesn't even have a passport. So it was a mission impossible. I knew there was no way we can get her out within this organization. So by Friday night, I was pulling my hair and thinking, you know, it's not going to happen.
And of course, Friday night is, as I know as a former foreign correspondent for the Sunday Times, is the night you have to file. So you've got these very, very conflicting issues going on, haven't you? One being the journalist and one wanting to save this child. You, as you write in the book, then had help from an American angel. Tell us about her.
My colleague who was covering the war with me in Iraq at the time, John Swain, was like 2 floors below, and that particular week, for some reason, we usually see each other every day, but you know, it was a crazy time anyway, and we had a lot to do. So for 2 days before, he and I hadn't met, so we used to call each other at night very late just to check that we're fine and what each one did, you know, and how we're getting on with the story. And so John called me about midnight Friday, and he's saying, you know, what's been going on with you? How's it going? And I was like, by then, again, very emotional and my usual frenzy. And I said, John, you know, there's this girl, and she's gonna die, and we can't save her, and we can't do anything. And Sean's tried to help, and the office sent Merlin, and it's like I did the crazy scenario with John immediately, and he knew it was bad for me to be reacting like that. So he said, what is it? So I told him, and he said, well, give me her details, and put the phone down. And there was this young American, Marla Ruzicka, and I didn't know Marla then. I hadn't met her before, but Marla had already been in Afghanistan, and she was a young American. When you looked at her, you thought, this woman shouldn't be here. She should be on some beach in California surfing, you know. And yet she was running around the world into troubled places like this. And her mission in life was to to get compensation for these for the victims of the war, and to make sure that the American government, or with whatever government, mainly with her it was the American government, actually paid compensation. She was a very good friend of John's, and she was sleeping or staying over in his room, because Marla also hasn't got the kind of money that we had from newspapers. She was a single, an organization run by this one 22-year-old something, very poor, but everybody loved her, so she stayed in everybody's room, everybody helped her, but because she did so well, so good for everybody else. So Marla was in his room, he briefed her, and before I knew it, Marla had taken the case and decided she would visit the hospital the following morning and get Zahra out.
And it's a wonderful story about how she does it. As you say, this young American woman with no backup, no resources, turns up at the hospital and somehow manages to persuade the US Army to take this kid out.
She had a frustrating morning. She called, because she has contacts with the military, obviously, from her work also in Afghanistan, and so she contacted and phoned whoever, and everybody was saying they were busy. It was busy times, They didn't have the helicopters, they didn't have, they couldn't send the medical team to check. They didn't have. So Marla was getting very upset. She'd seen Zahra as well, and the same way probably I reacted, Marla did, and she realized we had very little time and we should do something. So I think when everything else failed, she went out and did what she did best, which was basically convince people, and she had a way of convincing people. So she kind of dragged this American senior, whatever, captain or whoever was on the ground.
She went to the tanks in front of the hospital, didn't she? She goes, "Where's your commander?
Where's your commander? Who is the commander?" And got to the commander, literally forced him physically into the hospital, just by Zahra's bed, and said, "This is what we've done. Are we going to let her die or help her?" And the commander had children, so he reacted because he thought of his children. And within the next half hour to an hour, the helicopters were available. They were going to medevac Zahra and whoever needed to be medevaced from that ward. So by 1, 2 in the afternoon, Marla had did what we had failed in 48 hours to try and do for Zahra, and somehow managed to get Zahra out of there into the field hospital, together with 2 other seriously burnt women that were in the same ward with Zahra at the time.
Now, I should say that what makes this story even more poignant, as you indicate in the reading, is that you had spent nearly 10 years trying to have a baby, and I think any woman who has struggled, or any family, I should say, struggled with the issue of infertility will really relate to this book, because it is an incredibly painful thing, as any woman knows who's tried to have a child, and so this makes it much more of a difficult story for you to cover, doesn't it? Because part of you wants to adopt this child and take her home with you.
Yeah, it was the hardest thing. I mean, I thought after years and years and years of trying, and then losing the plot over not being able to, and then finally trying to accept what my mother told me all the time: it's not in your hands, it's in God's hand. Let it be, Hala. Don't challenge, just accept and move on. So it took 10 years for me to be able to move on. And then when I did, I thought I'd put all that behind me, and that I would accept his final judgment, if you want, or decision for me, that you are meant to be somebody without children, even though I could not accept or didn't understand. So when I came, and by the time I got to Iraq, I had been doing this for a couple of years and doing my macho stuff and the stories I wanted to do, and proving myself again as a journalist, and getting back, with the Sunday Times. This is my boss. And so I thought, I was over all this and I could handle it. But I suppose the one thing and I've learned since also, that it's not something that one handles and just disappears. You never know when you turn a corner and it's waiting for you, and it does wait for you, because as much as you say you accept it, you don't really, deep inside, you don't totally accept it. You just learn to live with it, and you just accept that it's not going to be, so you make the best out of the situation and you move on. So I had moved on, and then I'm faced with these two little girls. Zahra was seriously injured. Her sister wasn't, but she was a 3.5-month-old beautiful baby, basically. And if you're looking at adopting, it's like everything you want. I wasn't looking at adoption by then. I never accepted the concept of adoption in the first place, you know, even before. But suddenly when I saw these two girls, and given that they had lost so much, they had lost the parents, they had lost the brothers, the sister, and they were left alone, I felt like, I don't know, something, again, I'm saying I had been there a long time and I was emotionally tired and drained, and it was like suddenly every question I had with God in the past about why did you choose me not to have children, it was like this was the answer, because you were meant to adopt these kids and to help them in life. So maybe it's, you know, you do this to yourself, but it made sense for me that, and I felt I could be so good for them, and they needed me then more than anything else because they'd lost everything. So I started thinking, yes, it was crazy quick, but I was thinking seriously that these two girls, I have to adopt them, I have to help them, and I should. And even though, you know, I won't be able to do what I should, you know, to be the perfect mother for them or the full mother. And I wasn't thinking, to be honest, at that point as a journalist, and I know we are journalists, but sometimes we forget the title, we are journalists, doesn't mean that we are inhuman and without emotions and without feelings, and we don't react or interact. We try and be objective a lot, and we are up to a point. But there are moments, and you know, I always ask myself whether I'm right or wrong. With hindsight, I now think, well, I'm glad I am. There's no right or wrong. I'd rather be somebody who reacts sometimes and maybe cross the line, and I did cross the line because suddenly I wasn't thinking as a journalist or the objective journalist, definitely not somebody, you know, Sunday Times and being the tough macho person that I was portraying to be. And I was just a woman who was faced with two little girls, who doesn't have kids of her own, and who felt that she could help them and should help them and wanted to help them. Nothing else mattered, whether I was the coolest journalist, an award-winning journalist or not. It was these two girls.
I was struck by a comment that you make in the book about finally giving up trying to have a baby. And you said that 9/11 gave you a new purpose. I decided I would become an action girl foreign reporter instead of a mum. Why was it 9/11 that gave you the new purpose?
I had been trying for children up to then, if you want, and during which time I had also lost, you know, I wasn't working anymore. I was concentrating on the fact that, you know, I mean, when you're trying for children, not just the normal way, but when you're going through IVFs and infertility treatment, and you become obsessed with this, it's another world altogether. And I was totally obsessed and engrossed in it. And I'd lost touch with newspapers. I wasn't working. I didn't have any more money. My name had faded, you know, if you want, in the media market. So I wasn't doing any of this, and I had gone through a really rough time getting to accept that it wasn't going to happen. No matter what I was doing, I was trying and it wasn't happening. And I was reaching a point of thinking, well, I'm nothing anymore. You know, I'm not even a journalist. I'm not even a woman. This is another thing with the Arab culture that comes, you know, that played a huge thing with me at the time. But more importantly, I'm not even a journalist. I don't have a career. I don't have money. I'm writing to TVs and newspapers offering services, but nobody is interested. I'm nothing. I was living in this beautiful house and thinking, so what? I'm just like a piece of furniture here. It doesn't even have children, you know? And then I was sitting, and then 9/11 happened, and I was watching the TV, and it was a horrible thing to watch. But on the other hand, it was like something, it was like I needed that push just to give me direction again, that you can be a journalist again. And it was like suddenly I felt I haven't lost if you want, the love of what I used to do, which was to be a great journalist and a reporter. I covered the civil war in Lebanon. I was very good at it. And if there, you know, having said that, if that's,
I think you can say that in the Frontline Club, yeah.
I mean, it's my country and it's at war, but I mean, you know, I managed to do very hard work there. So I felt something inside of me say, well, okay, you're not meant to be a mother. but by God, you can go back being a good journalist, a good reporter, and you can move yourself back to and forget about the motherhood stuff and just go full time with the work and really give it your all in a different way, because now you're not going to be preoccupied with the thought of children. You know, you've discovered all this, it's over, and go into another world altogether. And 9/11, I think when I was watching it, I was seeing journalists, you know, the adrenaline and the excitement of no matter how sad the story is, but there's still that, you know, as a journalist, you know it when you're in the middle of something huge happening. And I was like, God, I've missed this. I really missed this. It was what I loved doing before, and I lost touch with it all because I was driven by the fact that I wanted to be a mother. And suddenly I just felt that this is where I should go back to. This was what I was really good at and I can be good at. And okay, I don't have kids. Maybe that's even a blessing for this. Because I can be who I want now in a different way without that responsibility. It's also your psychological way of making things easier for yourself to accept. So you start finding all the reasons why, oh God, it's great, I don't have the kids, okay. It means I can do whatever I want, travel wherever I want, and do whatever serious story or dangerous stories I want without the worry of children.
Yes, because presumably, I mean, you wouldn't have gone to Baghdad at a time knowing that the American invasion was imminent. And of course, you know, as you remind us in the book, at that time, you know, none of us were quite sure whether there were weapons of mass destruction there, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it was a very dangerous situation. Presumably, you wouldn't have taken that assignment had you had a small child at home.
I don't know, it's a tough one to answer. I know colleagues of mine that have children, and a very good colleague of mine at Sunday Times, you know, Kirsty Lang, for example, and it's always a tough answer. We talked about this. Probably I would have thought a lot more about it than just say, yeah, immediately, you know. But I don't know, maybe, but again, I don't know, something in me also. You see, I felt I had this responsibility of being in Iraq. I was an Arab. Bottom line is I'm an Arab, so, and this was an Arab country that was going to be invaded for whatever reason at the time. And I would have liked to cover it because I could understand them, but also I was working for a British newspaper, a highly respectful British newspaper, and I could bring both worlds. Now, personally, because I didn't believe, I think, the fact, I never believed, you see, I never believed, and we had a discussion with my boss and colleagues at the time, I never believed they had WMDs. So I thought the whole thing was not there. So even if I had kids, maybe I would have gone, because deep inside, I actually really did not believe they had WMDs. If they did, it's another story. I wouldn't have found out. I mean, we would have all been blown out anyway. But yeah, it was, I would have thought much more about it with children, obviously, and whether I would go into a place knowing I might not come out. No, maybe not, because I would owe it to those children not to be. But when I didn't have that, it was, these are the kind of decisions I could take without worrying about, you know, I'm going to offer my children if something happens to me, basically.
And how important was that for you, that feeling of that as an Arab you needed to be out there explaining that story to a Western audience?
I felt very strongly about it, personally, because I felt I'm privileged to be working for the Sunday Times in this country, for a British newspaper. But it also comes, for me, it's always been the case, it also came with a responsibility, because as an Arab, therefore, this is a rare thing to happen. It's not frequent that it does happen. Therefore, I have a responsibility both to the paper, to provide them with the stories and what have you, but also as an Arab to be able to portray that world here, which we don't get a lot of access to, or we didn't in the past. So I felt, and as an Arab, when that country was being invaded and we didn't know what was going to happen, I also felt as an Arab deep inside it was, you know, if there's one place I want to be amongst my people, if you want, when the United States and everybody else was coming to invade it, to cover it, but also to be with them in their hour of need, because I thought as an Arab, if this was happening to me, I would have thought that they would do the same for us, even though they didn't during the Civil War, but that's another story. But yeah, but also I think from a journalistic point of view, I felt it was just important. And that I could bridge a world, because I could sit with them, talk in Arabic, I could see their frustrations, their politics, which I have a better understanding of anyway, because we grew up in this world, and be able to sort of report it and show the West side, because they don't get to see sometimes, because they're unable to go into the ambiance of something or to the heart of it because of the language or because of the feeling. yet I had all this background that would help me when I wrote a piece to bring that side of things to the Western paper. So I felt it was even more of a responsibility for me to be there, both for the Sunday Times, but then for the Iraq itself.
You describe in the book how you managed to get into Fallujah, which, as I said in the introduction, is at the time under the control of Sunni militants. I mean, how did you make contact with them?
This was over a period, and I had a very good colleague of ours who's Iraqi. He was working for us and with us since after the fall of Baghdad, if you want, and he was great. And I mean, he had a very good network of people, and he could get in touch with anybody. And he introduced me first Fallujah in the first offensive, with the macho world of Fallujah and the insurgents then, who were purely Fallujians. It wasn't yet the radical Al-Qaeda members, if you want. So we had been to Fallujah, covered that first offensive. Like I said, we portrayed another side of the story, if you want, by being in Fallujah and showing the suffering of the people instead of just what we were being told by the military. So these people got to trust us.
Because all the other journalists, presumably, were embedded with the U.S. military.
The first time, less so. The second time, most of them were embedded with the military because, again, Fallujah had become, I don't make light of why they were, because at the time Fallujah had become a no man's. You know, you don't go into Fallujah. Even us, we were worried because it was run by Al-Qaeda. People were being kidnapped. Westerners were being kidnapped. They were being beheaded. You know, that was the minimum you would get out of them, a beheading. I mean, if you got a gunshot, that would have been a blessing in comparison. So it wasn't a place where you wanted to go as a Westerner. So everybody else that wanted to cover it was a big offensive. Everybody embedded with the military because that was the best. They would get access to the areas. Now, I had that choice, but I felt again that I'm a bit privileged, you see. I have a network of people we already knew, not the Al-Qaeda lot, but the pure Fallujians that were in the first offensive. And again, my Arab thing came into it, that I would rather be in there because I knew from the first one that even though they had given warnings, they had given them weeks of warnings, you know, evacuate the area, we're going to blitz it. But I know people and I know the Arab mentality enough to know that certain men and women would refuse to leave their homes. They would rather die in their homes than be evacuated or end up on the street as a refugee. There will be children in there that are cooped up for whatever reason. There will be the aged. And I thought, well, we have to be there inside witnessing that. So then it was a long conversation back and forth with the office because this was the most dangerous thing to do and they weren't very keen on it for all the right reasons as well. I mean, Al-Qaeda were there. What if I was kidnapped? Arab or not, I was still a woman, an Arab woman, and in Al-Qaeda mentality anyway, in that kind of militant, it doesn't matter who, you know, women should be at home covered up from top to bottom anyway. But also, if they found out I was working for a British paper, I hold a British passport, you know, there were all sorts of possibilities into it. We discussed it and we made a decision that I would go with Ali, my colleague, and how did they approach you? I mean, I know you covered yourself up, but nonetheless, you're still a working woman. Well, when we had taken weeks to do this arrangement, and we were in connection with, if you want, other insurgent groups. Now, I say insurgent groups as in, here in the West, we refer to them as insurgents. Back there in Iraq, they refer to them as resistance. They were the non-terrorists, if you want, because in Iraq, there are the terrorists and the non-terrorists. So people who feel they're occupied and they're resisting, which is their legal right, basically. So these small insurgent local groups, we were in touch with them, and they arranged for my trip. And a week before, we sent supplies of food, water, everything you could think about for a duration that we would be stuck in there. And they had arranged that we would stay in a clinic, a makeshift clinic they had fixed for that offensive, for the injured. But on the day we arrived in Fallujah, I was told basically that that was going to be mainly for the militants, which means the Al-Qaeda lot. And even though Ali and I were given a room at the back, but the fact is I would walk in and out and they would see us, so that would have been a no-no. So the guy who had arranged it said, no, we'll take you to another house and you can stay with somebody else. Now, these were the young Fallujian insurgents who had remained behind because they were going to defend their house, their street, their neighborhood, if you want, and their possessions. And so it was Ramadan, and I arrived there, and the guys say, yes, you can stay on one condition, you cook. And I was like, do you guys know where I am, who I am, what I'm doing here? You know, it's like, I've come to write the story and to be with you. It's not, I'm not just a woman that your place is in the kitchen. Basically, automatically, your place is in the kitchen, you'll cook. It was like, well, if that's the only way I'm going to stay safe, I'll cook. What else can I say? I said, absolutely, I'll cook.
And you described the after-dinner entertainment, which was a bit worrying.
Yeah, and I mean, bless them, we cooked, you know, and it was, and they ate and they were happy, and it was a night that, it was the elections in the States, I remember, the presidential elections, that Bush was being elected second time, and so they were very gentlemen about it. After dinner, they cleared the dishes, they washed everything, and they provided food for me, and then the videos and the laptops came up, and then they started watching all these different CDs of insurgents, for example, firing rockets, attacking the Americans, and discussing whether this is good, this is bad, he's a good fighter, he's a bad, the Shiites don't know the Sunnis are better, the Sunnis don't, you know, and whether Al-Qaeda is good, beheadings, kidnapping. So it was a long evening of boys talking, basically, toys and wars, basically, and I'm sat in the middle of them, and the bombs are starting because they're softening the area, and I'm counting, and I think there was like 36 in the first half hour, and I've heard a lot of bombs in my life, but I still am jumpy when I hear one, and they were very close because the area was quite close to the front line as well. So, and they said, you can't spend all night jumping, you know, you'll get used to them. And surely, yeah, after a while I stopped counting and just started listening to their criticism. It was like they're criticizing a Hollywood film, but it wasn't a Hollywood film. It was, you know, people being killed and killing. Was that good? Maybe not. We're better trained. Maybe they should do this next time. So it was a long night, yes.
You must have been very frightened at points.
Yeah, my parents never knew where I was half the time. And in the back of my mind, I would always say, oh God, you know, if something happens, forgive me, guys, but, you know, maybe one day you'll think that I did it for the right reasons. That was a hard one because Steve wasn't with me at that time. Steve and I are always together in every assignment. My sister probably would have been freaking out somewhere, I know, but...
Because it was too dangerous for Steve as a Westerner to go into Fallujah.
Yeah, and it was... We had just arrived into Iraq and Fallujah happened. So the agreement was Steve was going to follow me. But I just asked him for the first time in my entire life, please just give me a few days to suss the grounds out, and then you come in. And Fallujah happened, so I had to rush into Fallujah as well. So it is scary, and I mean, you don't allow yourself to also live in the fear. You know, you don't sit and think back, I'm afraid, because if you do, you don't function. And if you don't function, you're more in danger of hurting yourself or doing the wrong thing. So you just make do with the situation and pretend to be braver than you probably are, and try not to be totally crazy about, you know, how far you want to go with the story. It was great that I'm in Fallujah, but it didn't mean that I have to sort of run around outside every 5 minutes and declare myself to everybody and therefore endanger myself further, you know.
Do you think there are advantages in a war zone to being a female correspondent, or are there disadvantages?
I think both, and I think it applies to being a male journalist as well. It depends on the situation. Certainly in places like Fallujah, the disadvantages were more because you are a woman and you're dealing with a militant attitude that doesn't even respect you as a human being, let alone as a woman, you know. So try telling one of them, you know, you're a journalist, like, you know, you would be killed for that. As in, you know, how dare you? You know, this is not your place in life, you know, it's sin. I mean, they consider other people, their same sect, as sinful because they don't abide by their same strict, if you want, dictum. So in situations like that, it's not an advantage to be a woman. In other situations, even if they're less militant, also it's harder to convince the male society, especially in the Arab world, that you know, they should just not see you as a woman, but respect you as the individual you're there, whether you're a journalist or TV or but you know, the profession that you are, and try and see you beyond the female scenario. So yeah, in the Arab world a little bit harder, but again, if you break that once you earn the respect, you do have a lot of advantages, because once you earn the respect, they actually come to you, and they actually open up to you a little bit more because you're a woman, and I think emotionally you won't sort of judge them if they are emotional, and you can, if you want, you can take a lot out of them than if you were just a male journalist interviewing them, for example. But it works both ways, even for the male journalists as well.
And I mean, as an Arab and a Muslim, did you have very divided loyalties in that situation? Because, you know, you're working for a Western newspaper, the enemy in many people's eyes. I mean, you know, did you have a lot of inner conflict about that?
Yeah. There were times when I was standing there thinking, I'm ashamed to be an Arab and a Brit, and I'm both. And I carry both passports, and I love both worlds. I'm ashamed to be a Brit, or if you want a European or an international, because we were causing this. And I'm ashamed to be an Arab because I'm amongst you Arabs, my own people, and I can't do nothing for you, and I belong to the country that is against you. So it was total conflict half the time. And then I would gear myself and think, okay, therefore, the best way you can do this is to cover it, and then try and bring this slot to this slot, and this story here, and this mentality here. And this was the way I would try and handle it.
Well, thank you very much. And I'm going to throw it open to questions now from the audience, because I think we've got another sort of 10 minutes to go. So would anybody like to ask Hala a question? Come on. Well, I'll keep on talking. And oh, no, there's one at the back.
What happened to Zahra?
Well, you know what? Before we, as I said, I think you should read the book, and I have deliberately not asked what happens to Zahra, because this is the story of what happens to Zahra and her little sister. And if she gives it all away here, you won't buy your signed copy afterwards. And I would really recommend that you do, because it's a gripping tale. And I actually, as I read it this weekend, I was like, oh my God, I've got to finish, because I want to know what happens to these two little girls. So I've very carefully not given that away. David?
Yeah, I just want to ask, when you look at Iraq today, compare it back to Saddam Hussein's time. I mean, he was a right royal bastard and all the rest of it. But today, for example, you have Shiites in control, whereas almost every other Arab state insists on the Sunni running things. When you look at it, how do you judge the situation there compared with the Saddam's time?
I mean, look, none of us in the Arab world were for Saddam in the past, and I think we kind of knew his vices before the world discovered or decided that, oh God, he's a monster. He's been a monster for a long time. For whatever reason, they went to war. And I say for whatever reason because I'm not convinced about, you know, the reasons they threw at us. Anyway, the point of the matter is Iraq better now? I don't know. I personally, again, I go to Iraq, I cover it, and I've seen how devastated the country has become, how many thousands and hundreds of thousands of people have lost. And I'm talking lost a lot, you know, like this book, this book is just an example of all the others, basically. They replaced the Sunni regime with the Shiite regime. The way the Shiite regime is going now, I mean, soon, you know, this guy would be the next Saddam. It's another dictatorship to a lesser extent. At least this is my personal opinion. Have we done right? Is this the way? I don't know, but I don't think so. I don't think it warrants all this. And I don't think it was any of our business to actually go. And if we want to go down that road, let's clear the entire Middle East, because they're all a bunch of dictators, if you want to do it that way. And we're going politics now, so I have very strong views and feelings about the war in Iraq, but also because I don't believe that the suffering and the death and the mayhem that came about was worth, you know, Saddam being a monster. Yes, he is a monster, but I mean, we're doing the same in different ways, under different titles, and that's all. We change the titles, and so we make it look better, but it isn't better.
Thank you. That's what I wanted to hear.
You talk about, oh, sorry, another question there at the back.
Were you in Fallujah when the what you call the resistance not the Al-Qaeda, turned on Al-Qaeda. And what made that happen? Were you there to witness this?
Yeah, the first offensive was purely against the American, nothing to do with Al-Qaeda. The second offensive was when they turned against Al-Qaeda. They didn't actually turn against it. Well, they didn't turn physically. A lot of them were very fed up with Al-Qaeda. And these were the insurgents we were with and talking to and who had fought in the first war. But the problem was always that they couldn't take the fight themselves and fight Al-Qaeda because they had one thing the Iraqis always said, and this is where the Iraqi hospitality, which is beyond anything you see in the Middle East, by the way, is that irrespective of our disagreement with Al-Qaeda and how they've gone, however, we can't physically go and fight them and kick them out because these are Arabs, they used to refer to them, or foreigners, who came in initially to help us. And therefore we owe them, if you want, that obligation not to fight them. So out of that respect, they wouldn't physically go fight them. So what they did is then they got the Americans, or at least they let it be known that they wouldn't be too upset if the Americans came in and got rid of Al-Qaeda on their behalf. This is in the offensive. Now, if you're talking about the recent development where most of the Anbar region and therefore all the Sunni areas literally turned against Al-Qaeda and went into the awakening councils that have now kicked Al-Qaeda out from many of the areas, yeah, because after that it got to a really bad state where Al-Qaeda was beginning to kill these people's families, their women, strict codes, Islamic strict codes, you know, women were not allowed to drive, were not allowed to go out, can't walk, can't drink, can't eat, can't do anything, can't breathe. Men weren't allowed to shave anymore. You know, this kind of, if you want, Taliban mentality was being placed in these little neighborhoods that Al-Qaeda were. So then the Iraqis decided, no, we can't have this. And then all the attacks against the Shiites, where you had car bombs in Shiite markets, Husseinias, and. No Iraqi accepted that. This was beyond what they wanted. So then they turned against Al-Qaeda and said no, and they formed the awakening and they allied with the Americans to kick Al-Qaeda out.
Well, I've read the book and I think it's a very impressive book. And you were saying what you felt about the cost of the war to Iraq and Iraqis. I just wondered whether you had any sense that there was the beginnings of a more pluralist society now than there has been in the past, or whether for you the loss outweighs whatever social political developments have occurred, because you described the walls that have gone up all over Baghdad between the communities.
I mean, Iraq and Iraqis, it's also, I mean, Lebanon has 19 sects, official sects, supposedly. My colleague, yeah. And yet, the intermix and intermarriage and intermingling of the sects, it's lesser than you'd see in Iraq. Iraq, everybody, Sunni, Shiite, is intermarried. The tribes are intermarried. The Sunnis call Alis, which in Lebanon you will never have, and the Shiites will call Omars, which again you don't have in Lebanon. In Iraq, it's very much like this. Now it's segregated, hugely segregated. And you know, when you hear stories also, I mean, and I know this, not just hear it, I know it for a fact. You know, couples are being forced to divorce because they belong to different sects. Because the Sunni tribe tells him, you're married to a Shia, divorce her, and vice versa. Now, however, again, I'm showing all the things that I find negative about it, but will there be a pluralist society later? I think, yeah, they're beginning to taste a bit of freedom now, democracy. They're still in mess, you know, they don't know how to deal with it down the line, but in 20 years, in 10 years, I don't know how many more will die before they get there. My point is it's not all lost, but it's hugely segregated, and the hate now that's in place in Iraq between the two sects is enormous. And I don't think these quick solutions that they've created and these walls they fixed, you know, and you know, numbers of dead this week less than last year, or this month last year, means it's all great. I don't think it's great. I think it's just, for me, I see it as just a period of calm that will then blow up again once the Americans leave, and we haven't seen the end of it. And that's my nightmare always, because I'm a very, on Iraq at least, I'm pessimist, not optimistic.
And given that you've got these very strong views, as you say, about the invasion of what happened in Iraq. Did you find that a struggle as well? Because you're there as you know, a reporter, a correspondent, to detail what's happening on the ground. Did you find yourself having to kind of check when you wanted to sort of go into a polemic or an opinion, or, I mean, was that a problem?
I mean, fortunately, I didn't have to write opinion pieces. They would have got a rant. I mean, it is always hard because yeah, personally, you know, I have conflicts with it. However, I was on the ground to report, and to report what was going on, which means what I'm seeing, what is happening, what, you know, ABC. It's much easier than actually putting your personal view into it. I didn't have to put my personal. Now, I could do my personal view by going through the story that I knew would show it, you know, in the victims, in the children, in the destruction, without me saying, you know, this is wrong. I mean, this story should tell on its own whether it is wrong or not, when 5 people are killed or a huge family is wiped out, you know. Yeah, but again, I mean, up to a point you can keep that side of things to yourself. I mean, I always knew that the war was going to happen. I always knew I was against it, and I didn't hide it from my office either. But that was never going to sort of affect the way I would report it, because I would still report it as I would report any other story, based on what was going on the ground at that particular time, which was what was expected of me and what was required of me.
And you keep your politics in check in the book. I mean, you tell the story of these 2 little girls, but we don't really know about your views about the invasion and so on. I mean, was that a deliberate choice?
Yeah, this was never a book about politics. I didn't want to write a book on Iraqi politics or the rights or wrongs of the war. I didn't want to write about, you know, the pros or cons of it, and I didn't want it to be a historical, analytical. It's not the kind of book. This was, for me, always going to be the book about these 2 little girls, because for me, these 2 little girls meant a lot personally, but also over the years, they became to symbolize for me all the others that we don't have access and time, and obviously also the situation doesn't allow in Iraq, you know, for us to report on fully. And for me, if you want, they are the symbol of all the other victims, if you want, and suffering that has gone on in Iraq. And so I didn't want the book to be political. So you can tell sometimes from areas where I'm angry or upset, but nothing to do with that. But I don't tackle the politics. It was never, I didn't want it to be. It's about them and what happened to them, and therefore what happened to Iraq.
Final question there at the back.
The news agenda has obviously shifted to Pakistan and Afghanistan, but listening to you speak, obviously there's still many stories and much reporting that should continue to be done out of Iraq, but it's not happening that often anymore. Do you have difficulty selling Iraq stories yourself to the Sunday Times? And if you can't get them in the paper and others can't, what are the consequences of that absence of continuing reporting in Iraq?
No, not at all. On the contrary, I think I would like a break from Iraq. So I keep on telling my boss, please, can you send me somewhere else? Okay, it doesn't have to be nice, but somewhere else, you know, another trouble, but somewhere else, you know. But the thing is, no, if you have a good story in Iraq, and there are, I mean, now we're talking journalistic terms, good story, there's, you know, don't take it literally. If you have a story that you need to do in Iraq, and it should be done, and you pitch it to your, whether it's the Sunday Times or to any of the other newspapers, we are allowed, and we do get the access to it. Now, perhaps it's gone down a bit, but there is also an Iraqi saturation, not just with the newspapers, but with people in general. You know, they've had Iraq, week in, week out for several years, and people need to breathe from, and they're bored with the Iraqi story. So it's different now. It's a case of finding a story that, you know, you don't bore people with, but you also you still bring the Iraqi story to them in a different way. And there are still some journalists going back and forth into Iraq, some journalists still based in Iraq. We're not based there fully, but we were never fully based there. You know, we used to visit it frequently, to a lesser extent now, but that's out of choice rather than because, you know, they're not interested in the Iraqi story. Right?
Well, I'm afraid that's all we've got time for, but Hala will be signing books in here now, so it just remains for me to thank her very much for this evening's contribution.